The February blizzard of 1874 struck the Montana Territory with the fury of divine retribution. Each gust driving ice needles through gaps in log walls where even the most careful chinking had failed. The wind carried whispers of death that froze saliva before it could leave a man's lips, turning every breath into a white banner of mortality unfurled in the bitter air. Through this Arctic hell, a figure emerged from drifts that reached past his waist, broad shoulders carving a path through snow that clung to his buckskin coat like crystalline chainmail. In his arms lay a woman, whose auburn hair matted with substances that spoke of violence and flight created the only splash of warm color in a world gone white and merciless. Her calico dress torn and stained with blood, both bright and rust-dark, told stories no decent person should have to hear. Shallow breathing created tiny clouds that dissipated instantly in air, so cold it seemed to devour warmth the moment it appeared. Near the stone hearth, a newborn's wail cut through the tempest's roar, a sound sharp enough to split kindling, desperate enough to wake the dead. The infant lay in a wicker basket, lined with rabbit fur, tiny fists batting at air that carried the metallic promise of approaching death. Through windows glazed thick with frost, lantern light swept the yard in methodical arcs. 3 riders circled the cabin on horses that blew steam like dragons, Winchester rifles catching amber glints from kerosene flames that danced behind glass. "Found her trail leading here, boys," came a voice that carried the weight of a man who'd never been told no and lived to remember it. Massive Mark wants what belongs to him, and he don't much care what condition it arrives in. Chaska shouldered through the heavy door ice, crackling from his coat like tiny bones breaking. His movements, though gentle, held the controlled precision of a man who'd learned that survival often depended on the smallest gestures. He lowered the woman onto buffalo robes arranged near coals that pulsed red as a heart's last beats. She stirred green eyes, struggling to focus through fever and trauma. "Evangeline." She whispered the name, emerging like breath through water. Evangeline Carter. The baby. Found her crying, all alone in the dark. Consciousness fled, leaving her body slack against the makeshift bed. Even in delirium, her arms reached toward the infant's basket with the instinctive protection of a mother wolf defending her cubs. The baby's cries intensified sharp notes of hunger and bone-deep cold that seemed to pierce the very walls. Chaska wedged the oak table against the door, feeling the grain of wood worn smooth by countless hands, seeking the same desperate security. He doused the lamp, plunging the cabin into darkness, save for the coal's dying glow that painted shadows like dancing spirits on the walls. Outside, boots packed snow with the distinctive crunch that meant armed men moving with purpose. "Check every outbuilding on this spread," commanded the same authoritative voice. Mark said she ran toward this place after the dance. He wants answers before sunrise paints the peaks. The Winchester's report split the night like thunder born in a clear sky. A 44-40 slug splintered logs near the window, sending wood fragments spinning through air that suddenly tasted of gunpowder and pine sap. Chaska dropped low, cradling the infant against his chest, while crawling toward his Henry rifle, the weapon that had kept him alive. Through winters when death stalked every shadow. Through a knothole worn smooth by decades of Montana storms, he could see the leader clearly, a man whose scarred face mapped a geography of violence survived and violence delivered. The rifle in his hands spoke of professional competence, the kind that killed without passion or remorse. Chaska's return fire split the night, the .44 rimfire cartridge humming close enough to make Scarface Sam dive behind his horse, with words that would have shamed a cavalry sergeant. "Hell and damnation, she's got protection." Sam's voice carried across the wind. "Fall back to the ridge line. We'll wait for proper light and better odds." Hoofbeats faded into the storm, But Chaska understood with warrior's certainty that retreat meant regrouping, not abandonment. Men like that always returned patient as death, persistent as winter. He wrapped Evangeline in layers of buffalo hide, tucking the thick fur around her fever-racked body with the care of a man tending sacred fire. Her lips moved soundlessly, speaking to phantoms that only she could see. In her delirium, fragments emerged, cabin burning, laughing while they took everything that mattered. The baby had quieted exhaustion temporarily, overcoming hunger. Chaska melted snow in a clay pot, testing the temperature with a finger scarred by years of careful survival. Still too hot for an infant's tender mouth, but cooling toward hope. Evangeline. He whispered the name foreign on his tongue, yet somehow familiar, like a song half-remembered from childhood. He had learned English from traders and missionaries, but this name carried music he'd never heard before. Water running over stones, worn smooth by centuries of patient current. Her breathing steadied slightly, as if his voice provided an anchor for her spirit to grasp in the shadow world where fever held her captive. Among his people, names possessed power to call someone back from the threshold, required speaking their true self into the living world with absolute faith. The tempest hammered the cabin walls with renewed fury, each gust a reminder that civilization remained merely a fragile shell over something far more primitive. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf's howl rose and fell like a lament for all the things that winter claimed without mercy or justice. Inside, by the warmth of glowing coals that provided the only proof against the consuming cold, Chaska began a vigil that would stretch 21 days and nights. He would drip water between parched lips when she could accept it. He would find milk for the baby through means he had yet to discover. He would whisper her name into darkness as many times as necessary to keep both their spirits tethered to this world of breath and heartbeat. Because in her torn dress and fevered whispers, he recognized something he'd thought lost forever when cavalry flames consumed his village, someone worth protecting with his life, worth fighting impossible odds to preserve, worth believing in when all evidence suggested that hope was merely another casualty of winter's war against the living. 20 miles southeast in Rock Creek, heavy Hank Morrison sat in Murphy's saloon's darkest corner nursing whiskey that burned no worse than the guilt eating through his chest, like acid through metal. His cousin Mark Donovan held court near the bar, voice booming with the confidence of a man who'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with money or violence. Mark's laughter filled the smoky air as he regaled his associates with tales of recent business acquisitions, but Hank had long since stopped finding humor in his cousin's stories. The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of unease that spread through Hank's consciousness with increasing weight. 2 months had passed since the barn dance, but that night remained vivid as fresh blood in Hank's memory. He'd witnessed Mark drag the red-headed girl behind the stable, heard her desperate screams cut short by the dull thud of a fist meeting flesh. When Hank tried to intervene, Mark had turned on him with eyes gone black as winter ice. "Family business, cousin." Mark had snarled, blood decorating his knuckles like rubies. "Unless you fancy finding yourself on the wrong side of territorial law and common sense." That night had poisoned something fundamental between them. The easy brotherhood of their youth, forged in shared poverty and mutual ambition, had curdled into something that made Hank's stomach revolt against food, against sleep, against the mirror that showed him a man who'd stood by while evil wore his family's face. "Hank." Mark's voice boomed across the saloon like a church bell summoning sinners. "Join us, cousin. I'm telling the boys about that Sweet Creek bottom I just acquired from the former Henley family." Blood turned to winter slush in Hank's veins. The Henley homestead had burned 3 weeks prior, entire family killed in what Sheriff Joe called an outlaw raid. But Mark's timing proved too convenient. his satisfaction too complete for coincidence. Tragic business, that fire. Hank said carefully, each word chosen like stones for a foundation that might crumble. Tragic for them. Profitable for those with vision. Mark's brutal honesty made the air itself seem poisonous. Best water rights in the valley, now available for proper development by someone who understands opportunity. Around the table, Mark's associates nodded with the synchronized approval of men who'd learned that disagreement carried costs. But Hank caught the meaningful glances between Scarface Sam and Glass-Eye Joe. Looks that spoke of shared secrets and common guilt. Course, there's still loose ends requiring attention. Mark continued his voice, dropping to conspiratorial tones. That red-headed troublemaker from the barn dance. Word is, she's been spreading malicious stories about prominent citizens trying to stir up legal complications where none exist. Joe's artificial eye caught lamplight like a malevolent star. Nothing a competent territorial marshal can't handle, assuming we can locate the source of these unfounded rumors. Oh, we'll find her, Mark said with certainty that promised suffering. And when we do, she'll learn what happens to folks who don't understand their proper place in the natural order of civilization. Hank excused himself, stepping into night air so cold it froze the moisture in his nostrils instantly. Each breath formed white clouds that dissipated like the ghosts of better choices. Every word Mark spoke made it clearer that his cousin had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed, committed sins that couldn't be absolved through blood relation or shared history. The barn dance assault, the convenient Henley fire, the manhunt for a woman whose only crime was surviving Mark's violence. Each piece painted a picture of systematic evil that demanded response, demanded action, demanded someone to stand up and say that enough was enough. But what could one man do against Mark's wealth, his territorial connections, his willingness to use lethal force against anyone who threatened his expanding empire? Hank had no proof beyond suspicion, no allies beyond his own troubled conscience, no authority to challenge the system that Mark had corrupted from within. All he possessed was knowledge that burned through his sleep and a growing certainty that silence made him complicit in whatever horrors were yet to come. The guilt sat in his stomach like undigested meat poisoning every meal, every conversation, every moment, when he pretended that family loyalty justified looking away from murder. Dawn broke cold and crystalline over the Montana wilderness 3 weeks later, painting distant peaks in shades of rose and gold that spoke of divine artistry unmarred by human corruption. Chaska had dozed fitfully in his chair, the baby nestled against his chest like a small bird seeking warmth, when a fundamental change in Evangeline's breathing pattern woke him with the precision of a sentry's alarm. Where before her breath had emerged in shallow, erratic gasps that spoke of approaching death, now it flowed deep and steady, as a mountain stream finding its course. Her green eyes, when they opened, held awareness instead of the fever dreams and terrible visions that had tormented her unconscious hours, like demons feeding on pain. She attempted to sit up, then gasped as agony lanced through her body with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Her hand moved instinctively to her side, where careful stitches held torn flesh together, work performed by steady hands during her darkest hours, when death had seemed the more likely outcome. "Patience, miss," Chaska said softly, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone accustomed to dealing with wounded creatures. "You've been dancing with death for near 3 weeks. Fever that should have claimed you twice over by rights." Evangeline's gaze found the baby immediately, and something fierce and protective kindled in her expression, like flame catching dry tinder in a hearth long cold. "Is she? Alive and growing stronger each day, though she's blessed with lungs that could wake the dead." He brought a tin cup of warm water supporting her elbow, as she struggled toward an upright position that cost her more effort than climbing a mountain. Drink slowly. Your body's forgotten how to process kindness. The water seemed to restore color to cheeks that had been pale as winter bone, chasing away some of the deathly pallor that had marked her features for so long. She managed several careful sips before her strength abandoned her, completely leaving her dependent on his support with the vulnerability of a newborn creature. 3 weeks. She whispered, her voice carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure. I remember fragments, nightmares about burning cabins and people laughing while others screamed. But it felt like minutes, like moments stolen from a longer dream. Heavy boots announced themselves across the porch before she could finish articulating the terrible memories. 3 sharp knocks rattled the door with official authority, followed by a voice that carried the weight of territorial law backed by loaded weapons. Open up in their official business that won't wait for social niceties. Through the window, Chaska observed 3 mounted men, their tin badges reflecting morning light with the cold gleam of authority absolute. Glass-eyed Joe sat his horse with the easy confidence of a predator in familiar territory, his artificial eye catching sunlight like a marble carved from ice. Behind him, 2 deputies flanked the cabin with hands resting on holstered Colts, their positioning speaking of professional competence and practiced violence. State your business. Chaska called through the heavy wood, his hand moving with unconscious precision toward the knife that had saved his life more times than memory could catalog. Report about a vagrant woman hiding in these parts. Joe replied with false courtesy that fooled no one present. Woman and a bastard child. Town councils decided they represent a public health concern requiring immediate resolution. Evangeline struggled to stand despite weakness that made her limbs tremble like leaves in autumn wind, her face draining white with effort and determination that impressed him more than courage displayed in battle. They can't simply, easy now. Chaska whispered, helping her return to the pallet while keeping his attention focused on the door that suddenly seemed far too thin to stop determined men with legal authority. He moved closer to the entrance, but didn't open it, understanding that once that barrier was removed, violence would follow as surely as winter followed autumn. Nobody here but me, and I'm breaking no territorial laws that I'm aware of. That's so. Joe's voice carried dark amusement that promised trouble with the certainty of storm clouds gathering over mountain peaks. Then you won't object to us taking a proper look-see inside that cabin just to verify your cooperation with lawful authority. I object considerable, and this remains private property under territorial statute. Deathly silence stretched between them like a rope drawn to its breaking point. Through the thin walls, they could hear leather creaking as men shifted in their saddles, metal jingling as hands moved to weapons with the practiced ease of professionals preparing for violence. When Joe spoke again, his tone had hardened like iron cooled in winter air. You're harboring known criminals, Indian. Woman's wanted for vagrancy, moral corruption, and disturbing the peace through malicious gossip. Babies bound for the county poorhouse in Helena, where it belongs among proper Christian folk. Open this door peaceable-like, or we'll bust it down and take what we came for. Before the standoff could escalate into bloodshed, new hoofbeats announced another arrival that changed the tactical situation completely. Dr. Arthur Leander's cultured voice cut through the tension like a scalpel, separating diseased tissue from healthy flesh. Gentlemen, what precisely is this commotion about at such an unseemly hour? Dr. Joe acknowledged with grudging respect, born of necessity rather than genuine deference. We've got ourselves a situation requiring official resolution. Need to take a vagrant woman and her illegitimate child into proper custody where they can receive appropriate care. I must strenuously object to any such proposal. Leander's medical bag struck the porch with the authority of a judge's gavel announcing sentence. The woman in question has spent 3 weeks at death's threshold. Any attempt to move her in her current condition would constitute deliberate medical endangerment, possibly homicide. I'll report such actions to the territorial authorities and the governor's office as attempted murder by sworn officials. Ain't our concern if she can't maintain proper health standards. It's my professional concern, and I'm making it your legal liability. Leander replied with steel threading through his voice like wire through silk. As the only licensed physician in this territory, I'm declaring this woman medically unfit for transport under any circumstances whatsoever. Any attempt to move her will result in formal charges filed with territorial and federal authorities. The standoff stretched for long minutes, while horses stamped impatiently, and men calculated odds that seemed to shift with each passing moment. Finally, Joe spoke again, but uncertainty had crept into his voice, like rot creeping through timber. This ain't finished by any measure, Doc. Mark's got legal claims to property in this territory, and that includes any lost items that might have wandered off his land without proper permission or documentation. Remove yourselves from this homestead, Chaska said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly promise of a man who'd reached the limits of his patience. Now, before circumstances force me to take actions nobody wants to see. More silence heavy with the weight of decisions being made and consequences being calculated. Then leather creaked and horses snorted as the men turned their mounts away from immediate confrontation. But Joe's parting words carried clearly in the cold air like a death sentence pronounced from a judge's bench. Mark always collects what belongs to him one way or another. You'd best remember that when the real reckoning comes calling with proper reinforcements. After they disappeared into morning mist that clung to the valley like smoke from funeral pyres, Dr. Leander entered the cabin, with his weathered face set in lines of professional concern mixed with genuine alarm. That purchased us time nothing more substantial, he announced with clinical precision. Joe will return with territorial warrants and sufficient armed men to take whatever they desire by force. We must prepare for escalation. Evangeline sat on the pallet's edge, the baby clutched protectively against her chest with the fierce devotion of a mother wolf defending her cubs. I'm beginning to remember pieces, she said quietly, her voice distant with the effort of assembling fragments into coherent memory. A barn dance in Rock Creek, the smell of hay and horses and men's sweat, someone laughing while I fought. And afterward, when consciousness returned, I found myself somewhere else entirely. Cold and dark with this baby crying like her heart was breaking. Not your biological child, then? Dr. Leander inquired his medical mind, working through implications with the systematic approach of scientific investigation. No blood relation whatsoever, Evangeline confirmed simply, but her arms tightened around the infant with the instinctive protection that transcended biology. But she's mine now, as surely as sunrise follows the darkest night. 2 days later, Owen Blackwood appeared at their door like Providence, wearing work clothes and carrying the dignity of a man who'd lost everything except his principles. The weathered farmer of 40 winters bore himself with the careful pride of someone who understood that integrity was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen or burned by those who confused power with righteousness. Heard tell you folks are having difficulties with Mark Donovan and his hired killers, Owen said without preamble, settling his worn hat on the table with the reverence of a man placing a family heirloom. Thought perhaps I might offer assistance in that regard, seeing as how we share common enemies and common cause. Chaska studied the man's face with the attention of someone whose survival had always depended on reading character accurately. Lines of grief and fury were written in every weathered feature, speaking of losses that went deeper than mere property or livestock. What has Mark taken from you that brings you to our door? My wheat crop, my milk cow, my boy's future that I spent 20 years building with these hands. Owen's voice carried the careful control of a man who'd learned that uncontrolled emotion was a luxury that led to poor decisions. Tommy was fixing to marry the Henderson girl come spring. Had it all planned, wedding homestead grandchildren for me to spoil in my declining years. Then Sam's raiders came through claiming we were harboring outlaws, burned everything down to bare earth, and scattered dreams like ashes on the wind. Evangeline shifted the baby to her shoulder, patting her back with the practiced gentleness that spoke of love, learned through necessity rather than instinct. Your loss grieves me more than words can convey. Grief don't plant new crops or resurrect dead livestock. Owen replied with bitter honesty that cut through sentiment to reach bedrock truth. But stopping Mark from destroying other families that might give Tommy's dreams some meaning might make his death count for something more than one man's greed. In the days that followed, their small band of resistors grew as word spread through carefully whispered conversations and coded messages passed between people who still believed that justice mattered more than profit. Beatrice Morrison, the schoolteacher with steel in her spine and wisdom in her satchel, brought news from town and connections among the decent folks who remembered what the territory had been like before corruption took root in positions of authority. Mark controls the sheriff, the territorial judge, and approximately half the county commissioners through a combination of bribery and intimidation. She reported during one of their evening planning sessions her precise diction, marking her as someone who understood the power of accurate information. However, there remain good people in Rock Creek who remember what justice looks like when it's not for sale to the highest bidder. It was Beatrice who arranged for supplies to reach their hidden refuge, using her position as an educator to move freely through the territory without arousing the suspicion that followed other occupations. She brought milk for the baby medicine for Evangeline's lingering weakness, and most importantly, intelligence about Mark's activities that helped them stay one step ahead of his increasingly aggressive hunting parties. But their most valuable intelligence came from an unexpected source that none of them had anticipated. Heavy Hank Morrison began appearing at predetermined locations, leaving coded messages that revealed the inner workings of Mark's criminal enterprise with devastating precision that could only come from someone with intimate access to the decision-making process. The first message was brutally simple. Cassidy Homestead, Thursday dawn, 5 men, fire everything. Make it look like Crow War Party revenge. Armed with this intelligence, Owen and Chaska intercepted the raiders before they could reach their target, turning hunters into hunted in a firefight that sent Sam's men fleeing into the night, with bullets whistling around their ears like angry hornets seeking flesh. The Cassidy family never learned how close they'd come to losing everything they'd built with honest labor and careful planning. More messages followed with increasing frequency, each one preventing another outlaw attack, or exposing another piece of Mark's systematic campaign to drive honest settlers from legally claimed land that he coveted for his expanding empire. But Hank's information came at terrible personal cost. The knowledge that his own blood was responsible for such widespread suffering ate at him like acid consuming metal from within. The breaking point came when Mark issued orders that crossed the final line Hank could not uncross. His cousin wanted the Morrison family burned out Beatrice's own relatives, who had settled Promising Creek Bottom that Mark's cattle operation required for expansion. Family's gotta go, Mark had said with casual brutality that made Hank's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Nothing personal, strictly business necessity. But I want you handling this one personally, cousin. Can't have folks thinking I'm going soft on law and order. That night, instead of following orders that would have damned his soul beyond any hope of redemption, Hank rode hard through a spring thunderstorm that turned mountain trails into rivers of mud and loose rock. He arrived at the Morrison homestead with rain streaming from his hat and lightning illuminating features haggard with guilt and desperate determination. "Pack everything you can carry and leave tonight," he told them with urgent honesty that brooked no argument or delay. "Mark's sending raiders at first light, and this time they ain't planning to leave witnesses who might tell inconvenient truths to federal authorities." The family fled in their wagon before midnight, disappearing into the storm like ghosts seeking safer ground, where decent people could build lives without fear of violence masquerading as law enforcement. When Sam's raiders arrived the next morning, they found only empty buildings and cold ashes in the fireplace, evidence of escape, rather than the conquest they'd been promised. The frustrated attack on a deserted homestead marked the beginning of the end for Mark's reign of terror, because Hank's betrayal had been discovered, and Mark's fury at family disloyalty knew no bounds when it came to blood relations who chose conscience over profit. 3 weeks into April, as spring struggled to assert itself against winter's stubborn grip, their supplies ran dangerously low, due to Mark's tightening net around their mountain refuge. The milk goat that Beatrice had arranged to board in Rock Creek remained trapped by increased patrols, and the baby's hunger was becoming a crisis that threatened her survival, despite all their careful efforts to keep her healthy and strong. "She requires proper nutrition immediately," Dr. Leander observed with clinical detachment that couldn't quite hide his genuine concern. "Another 48 hours without adequate sustenance, and we'll lose her to starvation, regardless of our best intentions." Evangeline attempted to stand, despite lingering weakness, driven by protective instinct that overrode physical limitations and common sense. "I can make the journey if necessary. You can barely traverse the cabin without assistance." Chaska interrupted gently but firmly, his concern evident in every syllable. "Owen and I will make the supply run after dark using terrain that offers better concealment. The risk seems disproportionate to potential gains." She protested, fear sharpening her voice with worry that cut through his heart like a blade. "If they identify you anywhere near Rock Creek, if we don't attempt this, the baby dies," he replied with brutal honesty that eliminated all other considerations from the equation. "We'll depart at dusk, follow the creek bed to avoid main trails, and return before dawn reveals our movements to hostile observers." As evening approached with ominous purple clouds promising another spring storm that would make travel treacherous, Chaska and Owen loaded a small sledge with trade goods, beaver pelts, and silver coins that might purchase what they desperately needed to keep the baby alive. Their plan was straightforward in concept: follow the frozen creek to avoid detection, reach town after full darkness, secure supplies through Beatrice's contacts, and return before dawn, painted the peaks with revealing light. The initial phase proceeded according to their careful planning. The creek bed provided natural concealment beneath overhanging willows, and patches of remaining ice supported their combined weight as they pulled the sledge between budding branches that whispered promises of spring's eventual victory over winter's harsh dominion. But as they approached Rock Creek's outskirts, trouble found them with the inevitability of death-stalking wounded prey. Scarface Sam materialized from behind cottonwoods like a specter of violence given flesh, his Winchester trained on Chaska's chest, with a professional steadiness that spoke of years spent killing for money. Behind him, 2 more riders spread out to block escape routes with military precision that indicated planned ambush rather than chance encounter. "Well, well," Sam drawled, his scarred face twisting into an expression that held no warmth, no humanity, nothing but predatory satisfaction. "Look what we got ourselves here. Indian and his pet dirt farmer out for a pleasant evening stroll in weather that would freeze the soul right out of a man's body." Chaska's hand moved slowly toward his knife, But Sam's rifle followed the motion like a compass needle seeking magnetic north, never wavering from its deadly purpose. Wouldn't recommend trying anything heroic, Red Man. Mark's got pressing questions about a certain woman, and you're going to provide comprehensive answers whether you cooperate or resist. Don't know what you're referring to, mister. Owen replied, his voice steady despite fear that danced in his weathered features like flames in wind. The farmer's hands remained carefully visible, but Chaska could see muscle tension that spoke of a man preparing for violence, despite the overwhelming tactical disadvantage they faced. That's so. Sam urged his horse closer, the animal's breath forming thick clouds in air, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Interesting thing about tracks in spring mud, they tell stories clearer than any book ever written by educated folks. Tracks of a woman running desperate, tracks of men following with bad intentions, all leading straight to that old Peterson cabin where you've been holed up like rats in a grain cellar. The horses stamped and snorted nervously, their movements creating a symphony of leather, metal, and barely controlled energy that spoke of predators circling wounded prey with patience, born of absolute confidence in the eventual outcome. Chaska calculated distances, angles, chances of survival with mathematical precision learned through years of staying alive when odds favored death. The assessment wasn't promising by any measure. Get behind the sledge when I move, he whispered to Owen, his lips barely moving to avoid telegraphing intention to their captors. What in blazes? Chaska's knife severed the rope holding their trade goods in one swift motion, executed with surgical precision. Beaver pelts and silver scattered across muddy ground, like offerings to capricious gods, creating chaos as horses shied and danced away from unexpected movement. In that crucial moment of confusion, both men dove for cover behind a fallen cottonwood, whose trunk was thick enough to stop rifle bullets if they were fortunate and quick enough to reach safety. Sam's Winchester boomed like thunder, born in a clear sky, the .44-40 cartridge splintering bark near Chaska's head and showering him with wooden daggers sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin. The other riders wheeled their mounts in tight circles, fighting to control spooked animals while seeking clear shots at targets that had vanished into cover with frustrating speed. There by the deadfall, one rider spotted movement and fired hastily. The bullet whined off granite outcropping, sending sharp fragments flying like natural shrapnel that peppered the ground around their position with stinging impacts. Chaska belly-crawled through willow brush, with the practiced stealth that his grandfather had taught him for avoiding cavalry patrols, his dark clothing blending with shadows cast by a crescent moon that provided just enough light to navigate without revealing his position to the hunters above. Behind him, Owen's labored breathing was too loud, too frightened for a man unaccustomed to mortal combat, where seconds meant the difference between life and death. A horse passed close enough for Chaska to smell its sweat and fear to hear the rider's harsh breathing as he searched the brush with methodical patience that spoke of professional experience in hunting human prey. Chaska held his breath until his lungs burned with the need for oxygen knife poised for a killing thrust that would empty that saddle permanently, but might bring the others down on Owen like wolves descending on a wounded deer. Instead, he grabbed a handful of mud and hurled it toward the far side of the clearing, creating a distraction that drew the riders' attention away from their actual position. The horsemen turned toward the sound with predatory interest. Chaska moved in the opposite direction, drawing pursuit away from his companion through calculated misdirection that turned hunters into the hunted. The chase continued through terrain that grew increasingly treacherous with each passing minute. Moonlight on wet surfaces created deceptive shadows that could conceal ravines deep enough to kill a man who stepped wrong. And more than once, Chaska nearly plunged into hidden gaps that would have meant certain death on jagged rocks below. Finally, the sound of hoofbeats faded as the riders abandoned their hunt in favor of warmth and whiskey, unwilling to risk their own lives in pursuit of quarry that had proven more elusive than anticipated. When Chaska and Owen finally reunited near their scattered supplies, both men were shaking from cold, from exhaustion, from the knowledge of how close they'd come to violent death in the Montana darkness that seemed to swallow sound and hope with equal hunger. We lost everything. Owen gasped, his breath forming white clouds that spoke of defeat and approaching despair. "We're drawing breath," Chaska replied with grim satisfaction that focused on priorities that mattered more than material possessions. "That's more than they planned to allow us tonight." But their troubles were far from over, and the journey back to the cabin brought them face to face with crisis that threatened everything they'd fought to preserve. They returned empty-handed to find Evangeline waiting with growing desperation etched in every line of her face, while the baby's cries had weakened to pitiful mewling sounds that somehow seemed worse than her earlier wails of hunger and need. I tried feeding her water sweetened with the last of our honey. She reported tears streaming down her cheeks like rivers of heartbreak and exhaustion. She won't accept it anymore. I think she's beginning to give up on all of us. The crisis deepened the next morning when disaster struck from an unexpected quarter that none of them had anticipated. A chimney fire erupted just after midnight, flames licking up the stone flue toward wooden roof beams, with hungry tongues that threatened to consume everything they'd worked to build and protect. "Chimney fire!" Owen shouted, pointing at orange tongues that danced with increasing intensity behind the main flue. "Whole place could go up if we don't stop it now." Evangeline, still weak, but driven by necessity that brooked no compromise, dragged herself across the cabin floor with a wet quilt, clutched in trembling hands that shook from more than cold. "Help me fight this before it spreads beyond our control." Together, they battled the conflagration, while Chaska maintained vigilance for external threats that might use the distraction to launch an attack when they were most vulnerable. They beat at flames with soaked fabric, coughing as acrid smoke filled the cabin and burned their lungs with the bitter taste of destruction barely contained. The baby, awakened by commotion that penetrated even exhausted sleep, began crying again. Weak, desperate sounds that added urgency to their battle against the consuming element that threatened to claim everything they'd sacrificed to preserve. Sparks drifted through the air like malevolent fireflies seeking new fuel, and for terrifying minutes it seemed that all their struggles would end in flames and ashes scattered by wind that cared nothing for human hopes or dreams. When they finally extinguished the last ember through sheer stubborn determination, the cabin reeked of smoke, and the infant's breathing had worsened from exposure to poisonous air that could damage developing lungs. Dr. Leander arrived at dawn to find them collapsed beside the hearth, exhausted but victorious over destruction that could have claimed everything they'd fought to protect. "We must get her into clean air immediately," he announced after examining the baby with clinical thoroughness that couldn't entirely hide his concern. "Steam therapy for her respiratory distress, or she'll develop complications that could prove fatal despite our best efforts." They rigged a tent over the baby's basket, using blankets, filling it with steam from boiling water, scented with pine needles that would help clear tiny lungs of the contamination they'd absorbed. Chaska held the cloth walls steady with infinite patience, while Evangeline monitored the infant's breathing with the intensity of a guardian angel watching over precious life entrusted to her care. Their hands brushed as she adjusted the steam source, and for a moment their eyes met across the makeshift treatment, a connection that spoke of shared purpose deeper than mere survival, something that transcended the circumstances that had brought them together and pointed toward possibilities neither had dared to contemplate during their darkest hours. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion that went far beyond simple gratitude. "For everything you've done. Everything you've risked, everything you've become to us in these terrible weeks." He wanted to tell her that protecting her had become as natural as breathing, that her safety mattered more to him than his own continued existence. That somewhere during their shared ordeal, she'd become the center around which his world revolved. Instead, he simply nodded and continued holding the steam tent steady with hands that trembled slightly from more than exhaustion or the lingering effects of smoke inhalation. Later, as the baby's breathing eased and healthy color returned to tiny cheeks that had been pale with distress, Evangeline tended to Chaska's blistered palm, a burn acquired from grabbing a hot poker during the midnight emergency, when seconds had meant the difference between controlled fire and consuming conflagration. "You possess remarkably steady hands for healing," he observed, watching her careful ministrations with growing admiration for competence that spoke of training and natural ability. "My mother was a seamstress in Ohio before circumstances forced us westward," she replied, her voice distant with memories that carried both warmth and pain. "She taught me precision with my fingers, claimed it was a skill that would serve me anywhere I went in this world." After a pause, heavy with unspoken history. "Before I came west, seeking a new life, far from sorrows that seemed too heavy to bear alone." He didn't inquire about the before or what sorrows had driven her to this harsh wilderness where survival itself was never guaranteed, and comfort remained a luxury few could afford. Some stories were too painful to tell until the teller was ready to share their burden with another soul who'd proven worthy of such trust. But as she finished bandaging his hand, her touch lingering just a moment longer than medical necessity required, he wondered what secrets lay hidden in her past and what connection they might have to the present danger that stalked them through these Montana mountains. Outside wolves howled in the distance, their voices carrying promises of continuing hardship across landscape that tested every creature's will to survive another day. Inside the cabin, their small band had survived another crisis through determination and mutual aid that was growing into something deeper than mere alliance. Something approaching family forged through shared trials that had tested them all and found them worthy of trust. But each small victory came at a cost that none of them could continue paying indefinitely, and their enemies were growing bolder with each passing hour of their desperate game. The real test was yet to come, and time was running shorter than any of them dared acknowledge aloud. The breakthrough in their desperate situation came from an unexpected source that changed everything they thought they understood about their circumstances. Heavy Hank Morrison appeared at their door one night in early May, his face haggard with exhaustion and moral conflict that had been consuming his soul for weeks, like a cancer eating through healthy tissue. Rain dripped from his hat brim as he stood in their doorway looking like a man seeking absolution for sins that haunted his sleep and poisoned his waking hours. "Need to talk," he said, his voice emerging in fragments like a man struggling to assemble words from broken pieces. "About Mark. About what's happening. About things that can't continue." Chaska's hand moved instinctively toward his knife, but something in Hank's posture, the defeated slump of shoulders that had once carried pride the way his eyes couldn't quite meet theirs, spoke of a man at the end of his rope rather than a threat disguised as surrender. "You're Mark's cousin," Evangeline observed, carefully shifting the baby to her other arm while maintaining distance between them and their unexpected visitor, who might represent hope or betrayal in equal measure. "Was," Hank replied with bitter emphasis that carried the weight of blood ties severed by moral choices. "Family only. Stretches so far. When it's mixed with innocent people's blood." Over the next hour, by flickering lamplight that cast dancing shadows on log walls, Hank revealed the full scope of Mark's criminal enterprise with painful honesty that left them all sickened by the systematic nature of corruption that had taken root in their territory, like a poison plant, spreading its tendrils through every institution meant to protect the innocent. The barn dance. He said, his voice barely above a whisper that seemed to emerge from some deep well of shame. I was there, tried to stop it. But Mark, he's got ways of making people choose sides. And being against him means... He couldn't finish the sentence, but they all understood the implications that hung in the air, like smoke from a funeral pyre. Evangeline's face went white, but she didn't flinch from painful truth that needed to be spoken and acknowledged. What happened to the families who've disappeared? She asked, her voice steady despite the horror they were uncovering piece by terrible piece. Henley family was the worst. Hank admitted, his hands shaking as he pulled out a flask and took a drink that provided no comfort, no relief from memories that would haunt him until his final breath. Mark ordered the raid himself, said they'd seen too much, might cause legal problems. Sam's boys made it look like Indian attack, but it was murder for water rights. Dr. Leander leaned forward with professional interest that couldn't quite mask his growing horror at the scope of Mark's systematic evil. The entire family, parents, older boy, grandmother. Hank's eyes moved to the infant sleeping peacefully in her basket, oblivious to the terrible truth about her origins that was about to transform their understanding of everything. Baby girl too? Or so we thought. Sam told me later he never found the baby's body. Said it was probably consumed by the flames. The silence that followed was profound and transformative, as the full implications crashed over them like an avalanche of truth that changed the very ground they stood on. Evangeline reached for the baby with trembling hands, holding her close, while tears streamed down her face with the weight of terrible understanding. She's not... She whispered, her voice breaking with emotion that went deeper than words could reach. She never was his child at all. Mark thinks she is... Hank continued with painful honesty that cut through their hearts like cold steel. That's why he's so determined. Why he's willing to risk everything. But the truth is worse than he knows. She's evidence of murder, not assault. The sole survivor of a family. Killed on his orders. Chaska felt something fundamental shift in his chest, a transformation from protective duty to something approaching sacred purpose that went beyond mere survival, to touch the very core of what it meant to fight for justice. In a world that often seemed designed to reward evil and punish goodness. This child wasn't just an innocent caught in adult conflicts, she was living proof of Mark's ultimate evil. A witness who couldn't speak, but whose very existence condemned her parents' killer with the silent testimony of survival against impossible odds. What changed your mind? Owen asked quietly, studying Hank's face with the careful attention of a man who'd learned to read character through hard experience and bitter disappointment. What made you choose to help us instead of him? Hank was quiet for a long moment, staring into dying coals that pulsed like a heart's last beats, seeking answers in glowing embers that held secrets of their own about transformation through fire and the price of choosing light over darkness. He ordered me to burn out. Beatrice's family, my own blood, people I'd known since childhood. When I refused, he said family loyalty only went one direction, toward him and his interests. Anyone who couldn't understand that was expendable. The implications hung in the air like smoke from burning dreams. Mark's corruption had grown so complete that even blood relationships were subordinate to his appetite for power and control, his need to own everything and everyone within his expanding sphere of influence. So, what do we do? Beatrice asked her schoolteacher's practicality, cutting through emotional weight, to reach bedrock issues that demanded resolution. We have truth, but Mark controls legal systems, law enforcement, most territorial officials who might listen to evidence. We need proof, Dr. Leander said with scientific precision that approached the problem like a medical diagnosis requiring careful documentation. Evidence that can't be dismissed or covered up. Something substantial enough to bring federal authorities into the territory with enough power to challenge Mark's local control. It was Hank who provided the key to their desperate puzzle, the missing piece that could transform their resistance from hopeless struggle to genuine chance for justice. Mark keeps records, he said, excitement growing in his voice as an idea took shape like sunrise painting distant peaks. Lying Lou Peterson, the county clerk, maintains duplicate books for insurance. Everything Mark's done, every bribe paid, every forged deed. It's all documented in Lou's private files, hidden in courthouse basement. Insurance against the day Mark decides he knows too much. Accessing the courthouse would constitute suicide. Owen protested, wincing as he shifted position to favor his old leg injury that never quite healed properly after a plow horse's kick had shattered bone and hope in equal measure. They'll have guards, and if we're caught attempting burglary, not if we time it correctly. Chaska said, his warrior's mind already working through tactical possibilities with a systematic approach that had kept him alive through conflicts that should have claimed his life. During spring roundup, most of Mark's men will be occupied with cattle. We wait for the optimal moment, enter and exit before anyone discovers our presence. But their planning was interrupted by sounds that chilled their blood and set their hearts racing with the rhythm of approaching doom. Hoofbeats moving through the night, with purposeful coordination that spoke of organized pursuit rather than casual travel. Through the window, lantern light flickered between trees like malevolent fireflies seeking their hiding place, with the patience of predators who knew their prey had limited options for escape. Company's approaching, Chaska announced grimly, checking his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned that preparation often meant the difference between life and death. And they don't sound particularly interested in social conversation or peaceful negotiation. Glass-eyed Joe's voice carried clearly through mountain air that seemed to amplify sound with the acoustic properties of a natural amphitheater. We know you're in there, and we know Heavy Hank's with you. Mark's got a message requiring personal delivery that won't wait for morning light. Hank's face went gray with the knowledge of what Mark's messages typically involved when delivered by armed men in the middle of the night. He knows, he whispered, his voice thick with fear and regret that came too late to change the choices that had led them all to this moment. Somehow, he discovered, I've been helping you. Now we're all targets for his particular brand of justice. The cabin suddenly felt like a trap rather than refuge, its walls no longer protective, but confining, offering concealment, but limiting options for escape or tactical maneuvering. Outside, the riders were spreading out in a coordinated pattern that would make departure nearly impossible without running a gauntlet of crossfire from multiple directions. Joe's voice continued with the patient tone of a man who held all tactical advantages and knew that time was working in his favor rather than theirs. Send out Hank and the woman, and perhaps the rest of you live to see sunrise, continue harboring fugitives from territorial justice, and we'll burn this place down around your ears like kindling in a campfire. Evangeline stood despite her lingering weakness, the baby clutched protectively in arms that trembled with determination rather than fear. I won't hide behind others while Mark destroys more innocent lives, she said with quiet conviction that impressed them all. with its courage. If he wants me, he can face me directly instead of hiding behind hired guns. Like hell, Chaska replied with finality that brooked no argument or discussion. We stand together, or we don't stand at all. That's how families face threats. But before anyone could act on brave words that might lead to noble deaths, the situation exploded into violence, with shocking suddenness that caught them all off guard. Sam's rifle boomed from darkness beyond the porch, the bullet splintering the door frame inches from Hank's head and sending wooden splinters flying like natural shrapnel. The cabin erupted into defensive action as years of preparation met the ultimate test of survival against overwhelming odds. Owen took position at the front window, his old hunting rifle steady despite pain in his leg that made every movement a conscious act of will. Hank grabbed a spare Winchester from their small arsenal, his guilt transforming into righteous anger that burned away fear and hesitation. Chaska moved to the side window, where he could cover their most vulnerable approach, while Dr. Leander helped Evangeline and the baby reach the cabin's most protected corner, where thick logs and careful positioning offered the best chance of surviving sustained gunfire. This is your final opportunity, Joe shouted over the gunfire that was already beginning to chip bark from the logs and shatter glass in windows that would no longer provide protection from the elements or from bullets seeking flesh. Send them out or we'll take them out permanently. Come and collect them yourself. Chaska replied, his shot taking one of Joe's men from the saddle with lethal precision that spoke of years spent hunting for survival rather than sport. What followed was a running battle that raged through the night like a war between heaven and hell, testing their ammunition, their nerves, and their determination to protect what they'd fought so hard to preserve, against forces that seemed determined to destroy everything good and decent in their small corner of the world. The attackers possessed superior numbers and positioning, but the defenders fought with the desperate courage of people protecting something more precious than their own lives, the future represented by an innocent child who deserved to grow up in a world where justice mattered more than power and love counted for more than money. As dawn approached and their ammunition ran dangerously low, it became clear that their mountain refuge could no longer protect them from enemies who possessed patience resources and the willingness to use whatever force was necessary to achieve their goals. The final confrontation would have to take place elsewhere on ground of their own choosing, where the stakes would be absolute, and the outcome would determine the future of the entire territory. Iron Ridge. Hank said during a brief lull in the fighting, his voice heavy with knowledge of what that name represented in Mark's expanding empire of corruption. Mark's using the old mine as headquarters for this operation. If we're going to end this, that's where it has to happen. Chaska met Evangeline's eyes across the smoke-filled cabin, seeing his own determination reflected in her green gaze that had become as familiar and necessary to him as breathing itself. Then that's where we'll make our stand, he said quietly, sealing their fate with words that carried the weight of prophecy. One way or another, this ends at Iron Ridge. Outside, Joe's voice carried the promise of approaching climax that would determine whether justice or corruption would rule their corner of the wilderness. Dawn's breaking, folks, time to choose between surrender and dying hard in a cabin that's become your tomb. But surrender was no longer an option for any of them. They had crossed too many lines, learned too many truths, seen too much innocent blood spilled in the name of profit and power that recognized no law higher than personal desire. The baby in Evangeline's arms represented more than just one child's life. She was hope for a future built on justice rather than corruption, love rather than violence, truth rather than lies that poisoned everything they touched. The ride to Iron Ridge would be the most dangerous journey of their lives, but it was also their only path to genuine freedom. from the fear that had stalked them through these mountains like a curse seeking its target. Whatever waited for them at the abandoned mine, it had to be better than a life spent running from the consequences of speaking truth to power that had grown drunk on its own corruption. As they prepared to leave their refuge for the final time, Chaska whispered Evangeline's name once more into the darkness, a promise that he would keep calling her back from whatever shadows lay ahead, no matter what dangers awaited at Iron Ridge. The vigil that had saved her life would continue until their last breath, regardless of the forces arrayed against them. The journey to Iron Ridge cut through terrain that seemed designed by malevolent gods to test every aspect of human endurance and determination. Spring runoff had transformed mountain trails into treacherous ribbons of mud and loose stone that threatened to claim horse and rider, with each precarious step across surfaces slick with moisture that turned solid ground into quicksand, waiting to swallow the unwary. Chaska led their desperate procession on his sure-footed Mustang, followed by Owen on his sturdy farm horse, Beatrice on a borrowed mare from Crawford's livery, and Hank bringing up the rear on a horse appropriated from Mark's own stable, a theft that would have been amusing under different circumstances, but now represented just another crime to add to their growing list of offenses against territorial law. They had left Evangeline and the baby at the schoolhouse under Dr. Leander's reluctant care, though every warrior's instinct in Chaska's body screamed against abandoning her when the final confrontation approached like storm clouds gathering over distant peaks. She had argued with passionate intensity, demanded to accompany them, threatened to follow on foot if necessary, to see this through to whatever end awaited them all. "Promise me," she had whispered as he prepared for departure, her fingers clutching his buckskin coat with desperate strength that spoke of love deeper than words could express. "Promise me you'll end this nightmare no matter what it costs any of us." "I promise," he had replied, sealing the vow with a look that said more than any speech could convey. A look that spoke of devotion deeper than life itself. Commitment that transcended mere survival to touch something eternal and unbreakable. Now 6 hours into their punishing journey through landscape that seemed actively hostile to human presence, that promise weighed heavier than the Henry rifle across his back, or the knowledge that they were riding toward almost certain death at the hands of men who had no concept of mercy or justice. The trail wound through Echo Canyon, a natural corridor between towering granite walls that amplified every sound like a great stone megaphone designed to announce their approach to anyone waiting in ambush. It was perfect country for killing, and Chaska's nerves were stretched taut as piano wire, with the certainty that they were riding into a carefully prepared trap where escape would be impossible and survival unlikely. Owen rode with his wounded leg, stretched awkwardly in the stirrup, favoring the injury that never quite healed properly, but trying to hide his pain from companions who had their own burdens to bear. His breathing was labored from altitude and the emotional weight of what they were riding toward. But his jaw was set with determination that spoke of a man who'd seen too many neighbors brutalized to ever consider retreat. How much farther to that accursed mine? He called over wind that cut through their heavy coats like knives sharpened on Arctic stone. 2 miles, perhaps less. Chaska replied, then raised his hand sharply as instincts honed by years of survival screamed warnings in a language older than words. But something feels wrong about this approach. Too quiet. Too... The Winchester erupted from high above like thunder born in a clear sky, the sound echoing off canyon walls with deafening force that made their horses rear in terror, while chips of granite showered down around them like deadly hail sharp enough to draw blood from exposed skin and pierce fabric with the precision of natural needles. "Ambush!" Beatrice shouted with admirable composure for someone facing her first experience with organized violence, spurring her mare toward a jumble of boulders that offered some protection from the crossfire that was surely coming from multiple directions. More shots followed in rapid succession, muzzle flashes, blinking from strategic positions along the canyon rim like malevolent fireflies dancing with death itself. Scarface. Sam's voice echoed down from the heights, distorted by distance, but unmistakably threatening in its false cheerfulness that promised pain and suffering with the certainty of sunrise. Drop your weapons and surrender peacefully. Doesn't have to be a killing today if you're smart about your choices and cooperative about your attitudes. Chaska's response was to draw his Henry rifle and send a .44 rimfire cartridge toward the nearest muzzle flash, with precision born of years spent hunting for survival rather than sport. The bullet struck sparks off granite that lit the shadows briefly, and firing from that position ceased abruptly with a scream that might have been pain or rage, echoing off stone walls like a banshee's cry. But there were more shooters positioned at strategic points along the canyon rim, their placement speaking of careful military planning rather than random banditry or opportunistic violence. As they dove for cover behind rocks that had been weathered smooth by centuries of wind and rain, Owen gasped and clutched his right thigh, where dark blood seeped between his fingers with the steady flow that indicated serious injury. "How severe is the wound?" Chaska asked, low-crawling to his position, while bullets whined overhead, like angry hornets seeking flesh to pierce and lives to claim. "Severe enough to slow my movements, not severe enough to stop me from fighting," Owen replied through gritted teeth that spoke of pain held in check by sheer stubborn will. His face had gone pale with shock, but his eyes remained sharp with determination that impressed Chaska more than battlefield courage displayed by professional soldiers. Bullet passed clean through, but it damaged something that bleeds considerably. Hank had found a position that offered both cover and a view of the canyon rim, where their attackers lurked like vultures, waiting for death to claim its due. I count at least 4 of them positioned up there. He reported his guilt and fear transforming into cold anger that burned away uncertainty. Possibly more concealed behind those rock formations to the east, where shadows provide perfect concealment. The crossfire was devastating, and carefully planned to take maximum advantage of terrain that favored attackers over defenders. Every time they attempted to move to better positions, bullets chipped stone around them with deadly accuracy that spoke of professional marksmen rather than common outlaws seeking easy profit from travelers' misfortune. But staying in their current positions meant slow death, either from the increasing cold that sapped strength and numbed fingers, or from attackers systematically working their way down canyon walls to finish them at close range where accuracy would be absolute and escape impossible. We need to break their line. Chaska decided, studying terrain with tactical eyes, that his grandfather had trained to read battlefields like books written in stone and blood. Create confusion, make them reconsider their positions and their commitment to this particular fight. He studied the canyon's geography with mathematical precision, learned through years of survival against impossible odds. The walls curved ahead, and on the far side, a narrow ledge offered a possible route to higher ground where tactical advantage might shift in their favor, like tide turning in their direction. But reaching that ledge would require crossing 30 yards of open ground under concentrated fire from multiple positions, a journey that would likely prove fatal for anyone foolish enough to attempt it without divine intervention or extraordinary luck. "Provide covering fire when I move," he instructed the others, checking his ammunition with the careful attention of a man who understood that every cartridge might represent the difference between life and death. "Shoot at anything that moves up there as rapidly as you can work your weapons." "That's pure suicide," Owen protested, pressing his blood-stained bandana against the wound, while trying to maintain his fighting position despite pain that made concentration difficult. "You'll be cut down before you make 10 yards across that killing ground." The baby dies if we don't reach Iron Ridge. Chaska replied with simple honesty that cut through all other considerations like a blade through silk. Evangeline dies if we don't stop Mark permanently. Some things justify risking everything, even life itself. Before anyone could argue further with logic that was both sound and terrifying, he sprinted from cover in a zigzag pattern that his grandfather had taught him for avoiding cavalry charges during the bitter wars that had claimed so many of his people. Rifles cracked from above like strings of firecrackers, celebrating death bullets, whining off stone and kicking up spurts of mud that spoke of shots missing their target by margins measured in inches rather than feet. Beatrice and Owen fired as rapidly as they could work their lever actions, forcing attackers to duck behind cover and disrupting their carefully aimed shots with suppressing fire that saved Chaska's life. Through the simple expedient of making accurate shooting nearly impossible under pressure, he reached the ledge and began climbing with desperate speed that ignored the pain in his wounded shoulder moccasins, finding purchase on ice-slick rock that would have defeated boots worn by men less desperate or less skilled in the art of survival. Below, the gunfight continued with desperate intensity, but he was moving beyond their field of fire, into territory where one slip meant death on jagged rocks far below. The first attacker never saw death approaching with silent Lakota precision, honed by generations of warriors who understood that survival often depended on eliminating enemies before they could raise an alarm. Chaska's knife took him from behind with surgical efficiency, and suddenly the defender's Winchester was in hands that had been trained to use such weapons for protection rather than predation. From this elevated position, he could observe the other shooters clearly, 3 men spread along the rim, like beads on a string, all focused on the rocks below, where his friends were pinned down like animals waiting for slaughter. His first shot dropped the man farthest to the left with brutal efficiency that spoke of years spent hunting for food rather than sport. The second shot sent another scrambling for new cover, cursing loudly and leaving a trail of blood on granite that marked him as wounded and desperate. But the third shooter, Scarface Sam himself, spun toward this new threat with the deadly accuracy of a professional killer who'd survived by being faster and meaner than anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. Sam's bullet creased Chaska's left shoulder, spinning him half around and sending liquid fire through his arm that made his vision blur with pain and shock. But the return shot was true, despite the injury catching Sam's center mass and dropping him from the ledge with a scream that echoed off stone walls before ending abruptly in the silence that only death could bring. The canyon fell quiet, except for wind whistling through granite formations and the distant rumble of thunder promising another spring storm that would make their remaining journey even more treacherous and miserable. "Clear," Chaska called down to his companions, pressing his hand against the bleeding shoulder wound while fighting off dizziness caused by blood loss and the aftermath of violence that always left him feeling hollow and strangely disconnected from his own body. Owen required assistance, mounting his horse, and blood had soaked through his makeshift bandage to stain his pants leg with dark evidence of serious injury that needed proper medical attention. But he waved off suggestions that he return to safety with the stubborn determination of a man who'd lost too much to quit when victory might finally be within reach. "That baby needs all of us," he said through gritted teeth that spoke of pain held in check by will alone. "I won't abandon this fight when we're finally close to ending Mark's reign of terror permanently." They reached Iron Ridge as the sun touched western mountains, like a dying ember painting the sky in shades of blood and gold that seemed prophetic of the violence to come. The abandoned copper mine scarred the pristine landscape, broken timber, rusted equipment, and the black mouths of tunnels that disappeared into Earth's bowels like gates to underworld, where devils made their home among shadows and sulfur. Smoke rose from several ramshackle buildings, and lantern light flickered in grimy windows that reflected approaching darkness with the malevolent gleam of eyes watching from concealment. But as they approached cautiously through gathering dusk, that provided some concealment, the acrid smell of fire-damp methane and blasting powder fumes mixed with something else, kerosene and burning wood that spoke of fires set deliberately rather than maintained for warmth or cooking. There, Beatrice pointed toward the main building near the mine entrance, where orange light flickered behind windows, like demons dancing in celebration of approaching evil. If they're holding the baby anywhere, it would be in that structure central to their operations, easily defended close enough to supervise directly. But as they drew closer, studying the complex for signs of their quarry and planning their approach, Chaska noticed something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The building wasn't just occupied, it was beginning to burn from within. Smoke seeping through cracks in wooden walls while flames licked hungrily at dry timber that would feed a conflagration capable of consuming everything within a considerable radius. "The whole complex is catching fire," Owen shouted hoarsely, pointing to orange light that was spreading with increasing intensity behind multiple windows throughout the ramshackle structures. They spurred their exhausted horses forward, racing against time and spreading flames that threatened to consume the very thing they'd come to rescue before they could reach her. Behind them, canyon walls echoed with hoofbeats and the ominous crackle of destruction feeding on years of accumulated debris and neglect. As they reached the burning building, Chaska's worst fears were confirmed through smoke and chaos that made breathing difficult and vision uncertain. Through a shattered window, he could see into the main room, where a wicker basket sat perilously close to flames that were spreading across the wooden floor with terrifying speed that spoke of accelerant used to ensure complete destruction. The baby was there, crying weakly but steadily in the hellish environment that threatened to claim her life within minutes. But between them and the child stood Glass-Eye Joe with his remaining deputies' weapons drawn and ready for the final confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would rule this territory. And behind them, emerging from smoke like a demon rising from hell itself, came massive Mark Donovan, with murder blazing in his eyes and violence radiating from every line of his powerful frame that spoke of a man who'd never learned to accept defeat or compromise with those who challenged his absolute authority. For the first time, Chaska saw Mark clearly not just as an abstract enemy, but as a human being shaped by forces that had twisted natural ambition into something monstrous and consuming. He was a large man, powerfully built with hands that spoke of violence as naturally as breathing. But there was something else in his face, something desperate and hungry that suggested a man driven by needs that no amount of wealth or power could ever truly satisfy. "Well, well," Mark called out with false joviality that fooled no one present and probably didn't fool himself. "Look what the cat dragged in through hell's own front door. My dear cousin Hank the Indian and their ragtag band of troublemakers. Just in time for the fireworks that will end all our problems permanently." Chaska could see the baby clearly now, Lark, as Evangeline had named her, crying in her basket, while flames crept closer with each passing second, like predators stalking helpless prey. The child who had brought them all together, who represented hope for a future built on justice rather than corruption, was trapped in a burning building with the men responsible for so much death and suffering. "Release the child," Chaska said quietly, his voice carrying deadly promise despite his wounded shoulder that sent waves of pain through his body with each heartbeat. "This conflict is between us and you. She's done nothing to deserve burning alive for your sins." "Done nothing." Mark laughed with genuine amusement that was more terrifying than his anger, the sound echoing off walls that seemed to pulse with heat from spreading flames. "Boy, she's the reason for all this trouble. Evidence of my indiscretions, proof of activities that could complicate my business arrangements if the wrong people started asking uncomfortable questions at inconvenient times." Joe shifted his position slightly, and Chaska caught the movement in his peripheral vision with the awareness that came from years of staying alive when odds favored death. 3 guns against their small group with Owen wounded and Hank's loyalty still questionable despite his recent assistance. The tactical situation looked grim by any measure. But then Hank spoke with quiet certainty that changed everything about their desperate circumstances, his voice carrying the weight of truth that could transform understanding and shift the balance of power. You're wrong about the baby cousin. Dead wrong about what she represents and why you've been so determined to reclaim her. Mark's confident expression flickered with the first hint of uncertainty, like a crack appearing in stone that seemed solid until pressure revealed hidden weaknesses. What are you talking about now? She's not your child, Hank said with devastating simplicity that landed like a physical blow. Never was. You've been chasing shadows, hunting evidence of a crime that never happened the way you think it did. The silence that followed was broken only by the baby's cries and the increasing roar of flames consuming the building around them with insatiable hunger for destruction. Mark's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, disbelief, finally a rage so pure it seemed to physically transform him into something barely recognizable as human. Explain yourself immediately. He snarled his hand, moving toward his holstered Colt with dangerous intent that promised violence regardless of explanations. Hank's response was to pull out a folded document from his coat pocket, one of Lying Lou's private records, that detailed the true sequence of events with precision that only an insider could provide. The Henley family, he said with calm certainty of a man stating indisputable facts. You ordered their deaths to cover up the barn dance assault. But their baby survived the fire, and that woman found her among the ruins. The child you've been hunting as evidence of rape is actually evidence of murder, an entire family you killed to hide your other crimes. The revelation struck Mark like a physical blow, staggering him backward as the full implications crashed over him like an avalanche of truth that buried every assumption he'd built his actions upon. Everything he'd done, every risk he'd taken, every life he'd destroyed, had been based on a false premise that had cost more innocent lives than anyone could count. You mean to tell me? He whispered, his voice barely audible over crackling flames that seemed to laugh at human folly. You've been destroying yourself and everyone around you over a child who proves nothing except your capacity for evil. Hank finished with quiet satisfaction that carried the weight of justice finally being served. Perfect justice for a man who never understood the difference between power and righteousness. That was when the building's roof finally caught fire, in earnest, sending sheets of flame racing across dry wooden shingles toward supporting beams that held the entire structure together. They had perhaps 90 seconds before the whole building collapsed into a blazing inferno that would claim everyone trapped inside. Joe and his deputies, faced with the choice between loyalty to Mark and their own survival, made the decision that desperate men make when confronted with certain death. They bolted for the door, abandoning their employer to face the consequences of his lifetime of violence and corruption without their protection or support. But Mark, driven beyond rational thought by rage and the knowledge of his own systematic stupidity, drew his Colt and aimed it directly at the baby's basket, with hands that shook from fury rather than fear of the flames that surrounded them all. If I can't have her, nobody can, he snarled with the logic of a madman pushed beyond all limits of sanity or human decency. That was when Chaska moved with deadly precision, born of desperate love and protective instinct that transcended personal safety or concern for his own survival. His wounded shoulder screamed in protest, but he dove across the space between them, tackling Mark around the waist and driving both of them away from the baby's endangered position. What followed was a brutal hand-to-hand fight between 2 men who had crossed the line where retreat was no longer possible, and compromise had become meaningless. Mark was bigger and stronger, built like a man who'd spent years using physical violence to solve problems and intimidate opponents. But Chaska had the advantage of righteous purpose and years of survival training that had prepared him for exactly this moment when everything he cared about hung in the balance. They rolled across the burning floor, trading blows that would have felled lesser men, each seeking the leverage that would end the fight permanently and decisively. Mark's Colt flew across the room, lost in smoke and debris, while Chaska's knife remained firmly in his grasp, despite pain that made his left arm nearly useless for anything requiring fine motor control. Around them, the building groaned and shuddered as supporting beams began to fail under the assault of consuming flames that had found rich fuel in decades of accumulated timber and debris. Pieces of burning wood crashed to the floor, sending up showers of sparks that promised imminent collapse of the entire structure. Chaska. Hank's voice cut through chaos as he scooped up the baby's basket and headed for the door with desperate speed. Building's coming down. Get out now before it's too late. But Chaska was locked in mortal combat with a man who had chosen death over defeat, who preferred destroying everything rather than admitting the fundamental error of his assumptions about power and control. Mark's hands found Chaska's throat, squeezing with desperate strength, while his eyes reflected flames that surrounded them like fires of hell itself. With his remaining strength and the knowledge that Evangeline and Lark depended on his survival, Chaska drove his knife upward with surgical precision, born of necessity rather than cruelty. The blade found its mark between Mark's ribs, piercing the heart that had grown so black with corruption it could no longer sustain life. Mark's grip loosened, and his eyes went wide with the surprise that death brings to those who never expected their own mortality to catch up with their crimes. He fell backward into flames that had been consuming his empire, and Chaska rolled away from the conflagration just as the main support beam crashed down where he had been fighting for his life and the lives of those he'd sworn to protect. He staggered toward the door, his wounded shoulders sending waves of agony through his body with each movement, each breath, each heartbeat that reminded him he was still alive when death had seemed certain. Behind him, the building collapsed into itself with a roar that shook the very mountains and could be heard for miles across wilderness that had witnessed the end of an empire built on blood and corruption. When he emerged into cool night air, coughing and singed but miraculously alive, he found Hank holding the baby while Owen and Beatrice waited with expressions of profound relief mixed with exhaustion that came from surviving something that should have killed them all. The child was crying, but unharmed, her voice strong and clear in mountain air that promised hope for the future they had fought so hard to preserve. "It's over," Hank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had chosen justice over blood loyalty and found peace in that decision. "Mark's dead, his empire's burning, and the territory can finally start healing from the poison he spread, like a disease through every institution meant to protect the innocent." But even as they celebrated their hard-won victory over corruption and violence, Chaska's thoughts were already turning toward the schoolhouse, where Evangeline waited for news of their success or failure. The baby in Hank's arms needed to be reunited with the only mother she had ever known, and he needed to see Evangeline's green eyes light up with relief and joy that would make all their sacrifices worthwhile. The ride back through darkness was easier, despite their wounds and their exhaustion and the dying light that made mountain trails treacherous for horses and riders alike. They carried with them something more precious than gold or silver, the knowledge that justice had finally triumphed over corruption, that love had proven stronger than violence, and that the future held promise for those brave enough to fight for what was right, regardless of personal cost. When they finally reached the schoolhouse, as dawn broke golden over distant peaks, Evangeline was waiting on the porch with Dr. Leander beside her, her face anxious with worry that had kept her awake through the long night of not knowing whether the men she'd come to care about would return alive or become martyrs to a cause that demanded everything they had to give. The moment she saw the baby in Hank's arms, her composure broke completely, like a dam giving way to floodwaters of emotion. She ran down the steps with tears streaming down her face and gathered Lark to her chest, whispering words of love and protection into the child's ear, with the fierce devotion that had sustained them all through their darkest hours. Chaska watched this reunion with satisfaction that went deeper than mere accomplishment or victory over enemies. This was what they had fought for, not just the end of Mark's tyranny, but the preservation of love and family in a harsh world that often seemed designed to destroy such precious things through violence and corruption. "Is it truly finished?" Evangeline asked, her voice muffled against the baby's soft hair, while tears of relief and joy continued to flow down her cheeks. "It's finished," he confirmed with absolute certainty that came from having looked evil in the face and emerged victorious through courage and sacrifice. Mark's dead, his men scattered to the four winds, and his criminal enterprise burned to the ground, where it can never harm innocent people again. 3 weeks later, as spring finally asserted itself over winter's stubborn grip on the Montana territory, Chaska found himself working beside Evangeline in the garden plot behind her cabin near Sapphire Springs, the baby now walking with determined if unsteady steps that spoke of growing strength and confidence, played among the wildflowers that bloomed in response to warming weather and the promise of seasons continuing their eternal cycle. They worked in comfortable silence, their movements synchronized by shared purpose, and the kind of understanding that develops between people who have faced death together and emerged victorious through mutual trust and devotion that transcended mere survival. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing things that would feed them through the coming winter and beyond. "Look," Evangeline said softly, pointing to where Lark had discovered a butterfly that had landed on a wildflower just within her reach. The child was extending one chubby finger toward the delicate creature with a careful curiosity that marked all her interactions with the world around her. As they watched, the butterfly allowed itself to be touched gently before taking flight in spirals that carried it higher and higher until it disappeared against the blue sky that stretched endlessly above them. Lark clapped her hands with delight at the magical interaction, her laughter ringing across the clearing like music celebrating life itself. That evening, as they sat on the porch, watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple that spoke of divine artistry, Chaska made a decision that had been growing in his heart for weeks, but had never found the right moment for expression. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of water running over stones in the creek that gave their valley its name. "Dangerous habit for a man." Evangeline replied with gentle humor that made his heart skip beats, but her hands had stilled on the mending she'd been working on by lamplight. "About winter coming. About staying warm through the cold months. About building something that lasts beyond seasons, beyond years, beyond the troubles that brought us together." She set aside her needlework and turned to face him fully, her green eyes reflecting lamplight with the same intensity that had first caught his attention during her darkest hours. "What sort of something?" "A family, a partnership, a promise that goes deeper than circumstances or convenience." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object, a piece of cedar wood smooth-sanded and carefully carved. Burned into its surface with infinite patience were the words, "Evangeline, every night," followed by 21 small marks, one for each night he had whispered her name during her fever. But there was something else carved into the wood that she had never seen before, a constellation of 7 stars arranged in the pattern that his people called the 7 Sisters, the stars that guided travelers safely home when all other landmarks had been obscured by darkness or storms. "Among my people," he said softly, "these stars represent family that chooses to stay together regardless of the forces that try to scatter them. They're They're always visible, always constant, always there to guide you home when you've lost your way. He traced the constellation with one finger, his touch gentle as a whisper against the smooth wood. I carved this for you during your fever, when I didn't know if you would live or die. It was my promise that I would keep calling your name, keep watching over you and the baby, keep believing that love could triumph over darkness if someone was willing to fight for it. Evangeline took the carved board in her hands, feeling its weight and texture, understanding that this represented far more than skilled craftsmanship. This was a declaration of love and commitment that had been forged in the crucible of shared survival and tempered by trials that had tested them both to their very cores. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible, but carrying absolute certainty that came from the depths of her heart. Yes to all of it now, and always through whatever storms may come. They married 6 weeks later in a ceremony that reflected their unconventional beginning and hard-won love. No formal church was involved. Instead, they exchanged heartfelt vows beside Sapphire Springs with the entire Valley community as joyful witnesses to a union that had been forged in adversity and strengthened through mutual respect and devotion. Dr. Leander officiated with dignity, befitting the sacred nature of promises being made. Beatrice sang hymns in her clear voice that carried across the water like angels celebrating love's triumph over fear. Heavy Hank served as best man, his face solemn with the weight of new responsibility and the hope that redemption was possible even for those who had made terrible mistakes in their past. Lark, now walking with determined enthusiasm that kept everyone alert to her whereabouts, served as an honorary flower girl, scattering wildflower petals with the boundless joy that characterized everything she did. Her delighted laughter rang across the clear water as Chaska and Evangeline sealed their commitment with a kiss that promised years of shared mornings and whispered names in the darkness of nights to come. The reception lasted until dawn, broke over the mountains with music provided by a traveling fiddle player and food contributed by every family in the valley, who had found reason to hope again, thanks to their courage and sacrifice. As the sun rose over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of hope and new beginnings, and the newlyweds stood at the edge of their property and looked out over land that was truly theirs through honest effort and mutual devotion. "What do you see when you look out there?" Evangeline asked Lark, balanced comfortably on her hip, while the child pointed excitedly at everything that caught her curious attention. "Home," Chaska replied simply, his voice filled with wonder at how far they had traveled from that desperate night when a dying woman and crying baby had changed the course of his existence forever. "I see home built on something stronger than fear or violence or the hunger for power that destroyed Mark Donovan." Behind them, their cabin stood solid and welcoming smoke rising from its chimney to dissipate in clean mountain air that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers rather than gunpowder and burning buildings. The cedar board hung beside the front door, its carved promise as enduring as the love that had created it, and the constellation that would guide them safely home through whatever darkness might lie ahead. As they walked back toward the house, Lark pointing excitedly at a brilliant butterfly that danced among the wildflowers, none of them looked back toward the trail that had brought them through such darkness into the light of this new beginning. The past, with all its violence and uncertainty, had been transformed into foundation stones for the future they were building. Together with their own hands, their own choices, and their own unwavering commitment to justice and love. That night, as they settled into their shared home for the first time as husband and wife, Chaska whispered Evangeline's name once more into the darkness. A promise that he would continue calling her back, from whatever shadows might threaten them, a vow that their love would endure through all seasons and all trials. 21 marks on a cedar board had grown into a lifetime commitment, proving that some promises are worth keeping forever, and that some names are worth calling through any darkness until the light of love answers back with the promise of another dawn together. In the years that followed, their story became legend in the Montana Territory. The woman who survived 21 days of fever, the warrior who called her back from death's door, and the child who brought them together in love, that proved stronger than violence, corruption, or any force that sought to destroy innocence in pursuit of power. Lark grew up strong and free, never knowing the full truth of her tragic origins, but surrounded by love that made her wealthy beyond any measure of gold or silver, carrying the best of both her adoptive parents into a future bright with possibility and unmarked by the shadows that had once threatened to consume them all.